Welcome to 2017 Tiny House Fest Vermont. Yeah! The crowd went crazy as they shook all the rain off their jackets. So thanks for being here. I will now give you to Yulia. Give it up for Yulia. Our MC.
I would genuflect, but these boots are just not what I really had in mind today. I'm just saying. But I am a New Englander, so I was totally prepared. I had 5 pairs of shoes in the car just in case. All sorts of weather wear. Well, without further ado, I would like to present Rod is the planning director of the town of Brattleboro and has more than 25 years of experience as a planning practitioner and teacher. Come on back. He has worked with multiple New England communities, devising community engagement tools and drafting town plans, which is quite an undertaking, as I know from my town. Rod has a long-standing interest in the intersection between housing as a market-provided commodity and home as a touchstone for memory, belonging, and community. As a town planner, Rod has greatly considered the development of third places, and I would be very curious to find out what those are. Is it something in the mind or in physical space? And I will pass this to you.
Good morning, everyone. So, thank you for the introduction. So I thought what I'd do today is a little bit different from what I did last year, which was talk about the technical regulatory framework for actually living in a tiny house as a semi-permanent or permanent arrangement. And today, in keeping with the theme of the conference, I'm going to look at some public spaces and public places. And the emphasis here is informed by the idea that if we shrink our housing footprint to something that is tiny or even a little bit bigger, one of the consequences of giving up square footage inside your home is that you're possibly going to need more open space, public space to recreate and to meet people in and to socialize in and to feel as if these spaces outside your home are actually part of your home, part of your environment. And so that brought me to the topic that we worked on about this. We wound this up about this time last year. It was a project that was funded by the US EPA. We hosted a large consulting team in town, and we looked at this very neighborhood. So for those of you who are around for Tropical Storm Irene, where we were standing was the edge of the floodwater, basically. So you went down 2 steps instead of 4 steps and you hit the water. The parking lot over the road was underwater. And it was pretty much like that out to the Elliot Street bridge. What we did with this project was actually conceive it in terms of recreating this downtown or edge of downtown neighborhood and making it resilient, and then putting a focus on public spaces. So this is the study area. It's we're about here. This is the co-op here. This is the Main Street Bridge. And the area that we looked at wound out to a really large parcel here, about 12.5 acres, and I'll wind up this presentation with a brief discussion of this area here. This is currently vacant. It's privately owned, and it's had a history as being a location for mills. It has a canal along the edge of it here that's been filled in over the years, over the last 100 years. It used to be called Sawdust Alley. Up until about the 1960s, most people were familiar with it being called Sawdust Alley. For obvious reasons, it was full of sawmills, some of which made parts for the SD organs, and those factories are up here. Okay, so the idea here is that we wanted to understand the area from a natural standpoint much better and try and figure out if we were to reconceive of living and working and recreating here, how much space would be safe for us to do that in, and what kind of changes would we need to make. So these different colored zones here represent the floodway and the floodplain. So basically, as you can tell from where we're sitting, we're in it. And it broadens out. This is the brook here. This is Flat Street, and this is the brook as you go further down the road. So there's a very large impact here caused by flooding, and obviously as climate change proceeds, we expect this to be more frequent and more intense in its experience. So one of the key things was, following on, this is a nice segue to Dave's piece. If, along with climate change and a whole bunch of other changes in our behaviour, we reduce our dependence on motor vehicles, then we can start reconceiving of the space that we've got. So right over the road here, right now it's handy because it's full of exhibition tiny houses, but more typically it's full of people's cars while they're parked to shop and recreate downtown. What we conceived of was actually transforming it from a parking lot, which is its current use today, into an open space park, which assumed much more dependence on bicycle and pedestrian traffic than we presently have now. And then further along, this is my first third space. This is actually the back of private property here. This is the back of the kiln dry, which is this large property just down the road. It is what it says it is. They dry timber there. It's a Sosimo plant. It's been active for about 60 years. This is a photo from standing in the brook to the back of their property. This is actually frequented by large numbers of people who are looking for private space during the day or in the evening, with less secure access to housing than many of us, or less access to inviting and comfortable places during the day where they don't have to pay to be, or feel as if they belong. So people who are not attached to the workforce, people who are not attached to educational institutions or other places, spend large amounts of time in what I would call these third places or interstitial spaces. So it's private property, but it's not controlled very effectively by the property owners, and you can gain access to it from a natural area, that being the brook itself. Here it's reconceived as a pathway. There's actually been an idea for a Whetstone Brook pathway. We've got the beginnings of it right here at the co-op. It's about 300 feet. It's supposed to run all the way to West Brattleboro. It's been a fantasy and a dream of many people in Brattleboro for about 40 years. We've got 300 feet done. It just leaves, I don't know, 2.5, 3 miles. So this idea here would actually have some implications for the people who use the space now this way, because it's open to the public and it's got a more diverse set of uses. But we've also considered that this would enable a mode of transportation, a mode of movement up and down the brook, and a relationship to the brook itself that would be totally different from the one we have now. This one treats the brook as a dumping zone, which is the traditional mill town approach to a water body. The one down the bottom treats it as a public space that we could engage with directly and be proud of and utilize. So this is another one. This is a more of a private property orientation. So just out of the shot here on the left is the New England Youth Theatre. This is Elliott Street. This is a public parking lot owned by the town. And then this is the edge of the kiln dry. We reconceived of this area as a mixed use development with a mix of retail and commercial space on the bottom, and then a range of market through affordable housing apartments above it to intensify the amount of residential activity happening on the street. And so then it also justifies and underpins the use of the public spaces, what I've been referring to as third spaces. This is another example of redeveloping the Sosimo property. This is how it looks today. This is how the landscape architects envisioned it. So it's row housing basically, or freestanding multi-family homes. The vehicles are parked underneath so that the houses are higher than they normally would be. This means that they're out of the floodplain, means that they're, from a technical standpoint, they're not subjected to flooding. And then the management of stormwater and the management of floodwater is taken into account with this natural vegetation area in the middle, which also provides, again, public space for the residents and people, frequent in the neighborhood. So it's a completely different conception of open space in the sense that it's got an ecological function primarily, and then it's a social space, and it's intended for people to move through and not feel alienated or trapped away from private property. This is another example. This is actually the end of Frost Place. This is today's conditions, and this is what's intended. This used to be an old ice pond where they would actually harvest ice and transport it by train to Boston as a product. And as recently as the 1960s and the 1970s, people used to skate on it in the winter. It's now filled in and it's just a storage area for a local contractor. This is re-envisioned as a small neighborhood which would have bike and pedestrian access across the brook directly here to this neighborhood here. So establishing some continuity between a small family-oriented residential neighborhood and downtown, which is again a distinct change from the current settings. And so this brings me to the last part of the presentation before we get to chat about things, which I'm more interested in than standing here with these slides. So this is about 12.5 acres, and it's just to the western end of the study area. You can see the brook makes this really big turn. It actually didn't really make that turn during Irene. It kind of just blew out and it flooded these buildings. This is where the infamous shots were taken of the top floor of the building hanging over the water just after Tropical Storm Irene. This is the Elliot Street Bridge, and this is the beginning of Frost Street here. So we're just off the picture, we're about here. So as I explained before, there's a small canal that had been dug, and there were a series of sawmills and other water-powered industrial facilities along here, dating back to the early 1800s and the late 1700s in Brattleboro. And so they took the water out of the brook basically and fed it through here to produce power and to move waste product back into the brook, and it rejoins up around here. It's filled with about somewhere between 5 and 6 feet of gravel and dirt from the period of time when it was used as a storage facility, which means that the elevation of the land here is significantly higher than it would have been under natural circumstances. So we're working with the EPA and the state now through a series of more focused programs to actually figure out how to eliminate the gravel and the dirt and then allow the brook to access this area as a floodplain in frequent events, probably upwards of 4 or 5 times a year. The idea here is to actually develop this open space so that people would have an educational and interpretive opportunity to understand the natural forces that are in play here, and to give the surrounding neighborhood, which is pretty dense and underserviced with open space, access to open space. And the idea would be that somewhere for people to walk their dogs or their kids and relax, but also understand that the wetlands and the other ecological services that are in place are there to provide a buffer and a relief valve for floodwaters under those kinds of conditions. At about 12.5 acres and about 6 to 8 feet deep, this would actually slow or eliminate most of the water that Irene pushed down Flat Street. And when I say slow, it would probably slow it by half a day. So under those kinds of circumstances, you could imagine a big reduction in the impact and the damage further downtown. It's not unusual anymore to plan open space this way. It is to some extent in Vermont. There's an attitude born out of more rural settings that the easiest way to cope with flood impacts is to actually relocate away and just sort of empty out, which is a more acceptable strategy if it's a farm or low intensity open space, but it's more challenging in a village or in a downtown setting such as this one. And so what we're trying to do here is actually access resources and support for public open space, but do it from an ecologically informed standpoint and then also not reduce the residential density, but actually increase the residential density, because there are other benefits of people living close together and working close together, including a reduced commitment or need for motor vehicles and more compact, socially integrated setting. So, one last comment that I want to make about this work from the point of view of placemaking and creativity, which I'll get onto in a panel later on today, is that we were very lucky to benefit from the skills and the resources of the really large and incredibly talented consultant team that we hosted on and off for 3 or 4 months. And it may not be immediately apparent to all of you, but these drawings are actually really incredibly complex. They're to scale. So the photo and the picture fit exactly. And so if you go out there and sort of get a spray can or some string and measure it out, what you see down the bottom fits exactly what's up the top. And then the other thing that each one of these drawings represents is the regulatory framework. So each one of these drawings represents something that wearing my other hat as the person that would issue a permit, I could issue a permit for anything in one of these drawings. So it's not a fantasy or a fiction, it's a version of reality. And it takes an astounding amount of skill to actually be given a 250-page long technical document and then send a series of photos over the web to somebody and say, turn this into a drawing, and that's what you get. So from the creative standpoint, the last element in this is that this was arrived at through a series of design charrettes where the consultant team engaged with the public and other stakeholders. And so none of these drawings are just their fantasies at all either. They're the record of a conversation is a better way to understand these drawings. So each one of these drawings represents a complex engagement between the person who did the drawing and the people that they spoke to that gave rise to the drawing. And so on another level, this engagement with the public and starting with the public or members of the community and working up from there gives you a completely different outcome from an approach where you'd start with a set of technical specifications or a budget or something else and build something that was, or draw something that was that didn't come from the bottom up. And then the last part about this is this work reflects a commitment on the part of the town and particularly the planning department to engage in meaningful community development that takes social justice and ecological justice seriously. And this is still very much the beginning, but what we're trying to do here is deploy different methods that have been used in the past and approach our work from a more informed standpoint. So I'm happy to take questions. Or we can all go get a cup of tea. Yeah.
So it seems like most of the reconfigurations of open space that you're presenting put people at a socioeconomic lower standings to a disadvantage. And so I'm wondering to what extent you expect them to adapt to this reconfigured image, or if there is not very likely a chance of adaptation, where you're expecting them to relocate.
Let me take this drawing as an example. So it's a pathway, so it assumes frequent movement. And I think that when people are using a pedestrian scale open space like this just to do their daily chores, go to the co-op, drop the kids at daycare, go to work, those kinds of things, we psychologically are more accepting of people doing a variety of things, and so I think that the people from different socioeconomic backgrounds that are isolated and hanging out in the top space will still be accommodated in this lower space. It'll also mean that people like you and me are going to see these people more frequently and actually engage with their issues on some level if we can generate the meaningful dialogue that should be happening in the first place. Right now, they're hidden here, which suits us and them to some extent. Here, they're less hidden, and that's a confrontation for us and them. And I think that the way we structure that engagement and the way we think through the consequences of that are going to be important. I don't think it's going to be conflict-free. I think we see it coming up repeatedly in debates about how best to use public space. For instance, the panhandling debate that's been going on in town for a while is an aspect of that. Yes?
I'm just curious, what are Sir Sosimo's plans to sell that road? Do something with it? So that's a big deal, right?
It's a big deal. They're totally open to us thinking about it this way, but that doesn't mean anything. What I'd say is that it clearly doesn't owe them very much, and they derive a lot of income from it. But as a large corporation with multiple facilities, it's conceivable that in the medium term they'll contemplate concentrating their activity somewhere else. It's for contemporary trucks. It's actually fairly difficult to access that site, and it's noisy and it's crowded. So as they continue to prosper, they're going to want something a little bit more spread out, and they've invested heavily down the road. So, and it's not very efficient. So the kiln runs on a bad set of fuel sources, which means that their new one, which is more efficient and down the road, will take expansion soon. So it's potentially open if someone's willing to buy it.
So they're going to give it.
No, they run a business. It's an asset. I mean, you know, it has a value. Anybody else? Oh.
Microphones to the.
Oh, yeah, okay, good.
I'm curious what partners you think you'd have to bring to the table to fund something like this, and who would have an incentive to join your party?
Pass the mic back.
Do you want it, Jen?
The usual set. So
Who's the usual set?
I was not joking. So Vermont Housing and Conservation Board, and we are lucky to have a $35 million bond issue to deal with affordable housing just being issued in the last couple of months. So, and they're going to be at a panel later, so we can talk about this in more detail then. HUD is a potential source of funding. That's if it exists. And we used to think that the US EPA was a potential source of funding, but they early retired almost the entire unit that we worked with because they believed in smart growth and climate change because they had it on their website, so that's the end of them. And yeah, so the usual suspects. But I think we would also want to frame this in terms of it being a potentially profitable series of projects for private developers and engage in public-private partnerships. So it's a new market tax credit district. So if that program continues to run, and I think it will, there's a way in which we could put together a funding model that would work.
If you had those private sector partners come into the table, how would that change the implications for your public space use and how that was monitored?
I think that's a really good question. Yeah, okay, so the question is if the redevelopment of this neighborhood was to engage private partnerships, private property owners, what would the implications be for the design and function of the public space? And I think that there's a significant kind of cultural element, particularly in New England, where private property goes right up to the edge of a water body. And as you go west, that becomes less and less common. And when you jump a continent or two, it's actually illegal. So I think that the first thing we'd have to address is the attitude of the brook being people's backyards and open it up to public access. I think that that calls out the issue of treating the brook like a genuine natural asset rather than a glorified drain, which has been the Victorian era history that the brook has suffered under. So I think it's sort of one of those chicken and the egg problems. If you can make it more attractive, by the redevelopment process, then I don't think private partners will be troubled by it. But if it requires kind of heavy-handed moving in the first place, then it will. Yeah. The person's name is Jane Lambert, and she writes and studies on the question of keeping water on the land. Okay, I don't know her work individually, but I know that field of work. Anybody else? Okay. Thanks everybody for coming and listening. Stay dry.